To young enthusiasts, such as we, war consisted of following the flag over a shell-torn field, with fixed bayonet. Hadn't we stood for hours gazing at the recruiting posters? We could picture ourselves in the near future as pushing the Hun back from trench to trench, stopping only now and then to cut notches in the stocks of our rifles. What strikes me most, I think, is the eagerness of the men to get to France and above all to reach the front. One would think that, after almost 4 years of war, after the most detailed and realistic accounts of the murderous fighting on the Somme and around Verdun, to say nothing of the day-to-day agony of trench warfare, it would have been all but impossible to get anyone to serve without duress. But it was not so. We and many thousands of others volunteered. Perhaps we were offended by the arrogance of the German U-boat campaign and convinced that Kaiserism must be smashed, once and for all. Possibly we already felt that, in the American interest, Western democracy must not be allowed to go under. But I doubt it. I can hardly remember a single instance of serious discussion of American policy or of larger war issues. We men, most of us young, were simply fascinated by the prospect of adventure and heroism. Most of us, I think, had the feeling that life, if we survived, would run in the familiar, routine channels. Here was our one great chance for excitement and risk. We could not afford to pass it up. About 4 million men served in the U.S. Army during World War I, another 800,000 served in the Navy, Marine Corps, and other services. 5 out of every 100 American citizens took up arms. New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, and Texas furnished the most troops, 367,864, 297.891, 251,074, 200,293, and 161,065 respectively. The regular army numbered only 127,500 officers and men at the start of the war. The largest organization was the 2,000-man regiment. This at a time when whole corps and armies were fighting on the Western Front. More men were needed. The most obvious and immediate pool of manpower were the so-called citizen soldiers, the National Guard, numbering 174,008 men from every state except Nevada. Some 77,000 of the Guardsmen were already in federal service, mobilized for duty during the Mexican border troubles in 1916. The second line of defense, the National Guard, under mobilization orders since the declaration of war, was called into active service at 12 noon, July 25, 1917, and mobilized in their respective armories all over the Union. On that unforgettable day, at exactly noon, fire bells, whistles, and sirens were shrieking out their message in multiples of 5, for the alarm call to arms was 555. Startled people ran into the streets in wonder, leaving their noonday meals untouched. Such excitement prevailed, with everybody talking about war, that one would have got the impression that the enemy was only miles away. Bidding a hasty farewell to my employer and fellow workers, my fingers tingling from their earnest handshakes and my ears ringing with "good luck, don't forget to write," and "bring me back a German helmet," and the like, I started for the Somerville Armory, where Companies M and K of the 8th Massachusetts Regiment were stationed. The streetcar which I boarded hardly seemed to move. All along the route we picked up other guardsmen, who like myself were answering their country's call. Fares were forgotten, as the conductor, imbued with the spirit of patriotism, thought only of getting us to the armory as soon as possible. The bells and sirens were still sounding as we arrived at the armory. We had to fight our way in as there were hundreds of people milling around on the sidewalk around the wide-open doors, many of them looking through the windows. Inside the armory there were many guardsmen already in uniform and discussing the situation. I immediately got into my uniform and proceeded to the drill hall, shaking hands with others of my buddies. How true it was, as someone on the streetcar we were riding on remarked, "Well, a lot of us will never see the armory or home again." Of course, each one's chance of coming home was as good as the next fellow's, so no one gave it much thought. I remember looking around the room after my physical examination and enrollment. Here were the men I was going out with to war. Larry Williams was playing ragtime on the piano and singing. Someone told me his name. Everyone was talking and laughing. I felt a little thrill of emotion, and the phrase, "comrades in arms," came into my head. A year later, on July 19, Larry was killed by German shellfire on the edge of a thicket at Below Woods, and his parents received their telegram from the War Department. My parents bravely kept their deepest thoughts to themselves, but I can guess now what they were. They had me photographed in my uniform. I didn't see why. I attended a few evening drills at the armory, with my parents watching from the gallery. I learned a few men's names, and then the word came that the Massachusetts militia was to be called out July 25. I had been living in a mental fog, not thinking of anything, but feeling relieved that there was nothing more to be decided. The packing up was all Greek to me. I had never seen a gun close to, and I would have called it a cannon offhand. Someone told me to get on a truck piled high with packing boxes, and the truck jounced out of the paddock onto the macadam of Commonwealth Avenue. At the corner of the street stood a man on the sidewalk with a straw hat in his hand. He looked up. It was my father. He smiled, and I saw him still waving his hand as the truck turned the next corner. A great lump came into my throat and I winked back tears. The National Guard was to provide 16 divisions, numbered from 26 to 42. To this were added 7 regular Army divisions to be raised by voluntary enlistments. It was not enough. There was only one solution, the draft. Drafted men would be formed into the National Army, which, with the regulars and the Guard, would comprise the U.S. Army. By war's end, more than 3/4 of all troops would have come in through the Selective Service or National Army enlistments. Of every 100 men, 10 were National Guardsmen, 13 were regulars and 77 belonged to the National Army. The original plans called for 16 National Army divisions, numbered 76 to 92, to be mobilized and trained at 16 cantonments, and to be composed of men chosen by the operation of the Selective Service Act from 16 draft areas throughout the United States. The first registration, June 5, 1917, covered men ages 21 to 31. The second, on June 5 and August 24, 1918, included those who had turned 21 since the first registration. The third registration, on September 12, 1918, extended the age limits from 18 to 45. When war broke out, the total male population of the United States was about 54 million. During the war, about 26 million men were either registered under the Selective Service Act or serving without being registered. A diminutive Italian, Tony Monaco by name, water boy by occupation, presented himself at the Selective Service office early one morning. A clerk at the desk, his eyes still clouded, their hours of rest were not long in those days, not recognizing the young man as a possible registrant, said, "What can I do for you?" "Ma name Tony Monaco. In dese contrat 6 months. Gimme de gun." Had Tony descended from a passenger on the good ship Mayflower, he could scarcely have been more intensely American. Not all at first blush, however, were able to see their duty. An example of that class was presented by a grocery boy who had driven to the city hall in his employer's wagon. He had answered all the questions until the clerk asked him if he desired to claim exemption from the draft. "What's that?" he queried. "Is there any reason why you shouldn't go to war in case you are called by Uncle Sam?" said the clerk. "Who the hell would drive the horse?" was the somewhat apprehensive answer. A photographer wrote to the city clerk advising him that he would be busy with a June wedding on June 5 and that some other day would have to be set for the registration as he positively could not appear on June 5. Summoned by the order of induction to appear at our respective local boards, we donned our least desirable suits of clothes and reported at the appointed hour. The assembled group of recruits was put under the supervision of one of their number, selected by the local board chairman, and this important personage was given the title of district leader. Moving to the point of entertainment, we boarded troop trains while relatives and friends bade us good luck and Godspeed. Arriving at Medford, the last stop before Camp Upton, an army officer boarded the train and called on the district leaders to surrender the records of the men of their groups. Upon detrainment at camp we were formed in double rank and answered roll call. There we stood, soldiers, yet still civilians, home and friends behind us and before us we knew not what. Our feelings ranged from drunken hilarity to sober, quiet pondering. Construction of camps to house the hundreds of thousands of new soldiers was turned over to the Cantonment Division. Wooden barracks for the 16 National Army divisions and an equal number of National Guard camps with tents were required. All would soon become household names: Devens in Massachusetts, Dix in New Jersey, Custer in Michigan, Gordon in Georgia, Grant in Illinois, Upton in New York, Meade in Maryland, Lewis in Washington State, and so on. The magnitude of the effort was staggering. One statistician estimated enough lumber had been used to build a boardwalk an inch thick and 12 inches wide to the moon and halfway back. Inevitably there were problems, but by September the cantonments were two-thirds done with space for over 400,000 draftees. It was one of the great achievements of the war mobilization effort. The troop train on which I rode to Camp Funston, Kansas, April 29, 1918, was crowded. There were several hundred of us aboard and no time was lost in formal introductions. While passing through towns along the way, heads and shoulders were thrust out of car windows and loud yells greeted those townspeople who went to the trouble to go down to see the boys pass through. Inside the coaches, crap games were in full blast and drinks were freely passed around. Most of us were asleep when we arrived at Camp Funston near Fort Riley, Kansas, at 1 o'clock at night. A sergeant came aboard and ordered us to hit the cinders, pronto. Outside we formed a column 4 abreast and, directed by the sergeant, marched to our barracks where we were assigned cots and then told to hit the hay, right now. In 15 minutes the lights were turned out and we were ordered to go to sleep. Nothing more unmilitary in appearance can be imagined than the long columns of civilian-clad men, each with paper-wrapped or rope-tied bundle, or valise, or suitcase, which wound from train to barracks. The members of most draft boards flaunted banners and signs proclaiming their identity and often expressing the familiar legend, "To hell with the Kaiser." Some looked very dejected, a few were boisterously drunk. The great majority accepted the situation with that practical American stoicism which is equally far removed from enthusiasm or despair. These men had not chosen war, but since the job was inevitable, they were going to see it through. It was a Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. and raining like mad when our train pulled into a place called Camp Upton. They had a band of music at the station playing the Star-Spangled Banner to get us to feel like fighting. It did, the way they played it. A few roughnecks from the regulars received us. The sergeant gave us a command, column of twos. Forward, march. But we bums stood like a bunch of dopes, for we didn't know what a column of twos meant. All the way to the barracks, the 1-month veterans were saying, "Wait till you get the needle." Then came the calling of the roll and further discrepancies. Certain men would answer with alacrity to each of 3 names called, or stand silent while their own name was called as many times. As a typical instance, a man in M Company had answered, "Here," at every formation for nearly a week before he was discovered to have been left at home on account of illness and never to have reported at camp. Another ghost was laid by the following dialogue: Mora, T. Here. Mora, R. From the same individual, here. Does your first name begin with a T or an R? Yes, sir. Is your first name Rocco? Yes, sir. What is your first name? Tony. And all in perfectly good faith. We were marched off over rough uncompleted roads thick with dust, around heaps of building material, over spur tracks of the railroad, past half-constructed barracks, all to the tune of carpenters' hammers which clattered with machine-gun-like precision. Reaching a nearly completed barack, we were halted, and entering were assigned our bunks. To each man was issued his first army equipment, consisted of 2 olive drab blankets, a bed sack to be filled with straw, and a mess kit. We were then introduced to army chow in a manner which became painfully familiar to us. Passing along an over-tedious mess line to a counter, and armed with our newly acquired eating utensils, which we juggled with a difficulty born of inexperience, we made the acquaintance of army beans and that fluid which some demented people have called coffee. The metal coffee cup gave us more trouble, perhaps, than anything else, for it seemed to absorb all the heat of its contents. It became so hot that it would have blistered our lips had we attempted to drink from it. When it cooled off a bit we confidently grasped the handle, hoping to wash down a few beans, only to find, too late, that the handle catch was loose, and that the entire content was being swiftly dumped into the beans. Falling into another line, we poured what had now become bean soup into a garbage can and completed our first mess by washing our mess kits in soapy hot water and rinsing them in clear cold water. Thus endeth the first lesson. The barracks, there were 5 of them, strung out in 2 parallel rows, were long, unpainted, shed-like affairs built on wooden piles which lifted them 2 or 3 feet from the ground. In the center of each side was a door, reached by a flight of steps, and within, directly between the doors, a large pot-bellied coal stove stood in a shallow box of ashes. There were electric lights and by day the interior was well lighted by a row of windows which occupied nearly half the wall space from the height of one's waist to the eaves. Our cots were lined up, all the way around the walls, side by side with narrow spaces between. The mess hall was exactly the same kind of building, with one end fenced off by a counter, behind which were stoves. The company office occupied a separate room in the end of one of the barracks. Our company street. The lane between the 2 rows of barracks was an expanse of clay. We had for breakfast a cereal, oatmeal, cornflakes, or grape nuts, with sausages, fried potatoes, or, occasionally, pancakes with syrup. Milk was always the evaporated variety, watered. I do not remember seeing fresh milk served at any time that I was in the army. For dinner we had beef stew, or fried beefsteak, or beans baked in a shallow pan with bacon and tomato sauce. For dessert, bread pudding, rice pudding, stewed prunes, or dried fruit cobbler, pie made in a large baker with only a top crust. Supper was much like dinner, with macaroni and cheese a frequent dish. Coffee was served with all 3 meals, and we had all the sugar we wished at a time when the civilian population was being pretty severely stinted. The new arrivals received still another physical exam. All were also inoculated with smallpox, typhoid, and paratyphoid vaccines. The infamous needle. For many, it was the first inoculation of their lives. We reached a series of low shed-like buildings, and were told to sit down near our places in the line and wait until they were ready for us inside. "What are they going to do to us?" asked one of the crowd of a passing recruit. "Do to you, man? This is where you get the shot. It almost kills you, that's all." And, with that cheering information, which was passed religiously from one end of the column to the other, we tarried at the threshold of what we later learned to designate the mill. After half an hour of waiting, an officer stepped to the doorway and called to our group to get on our feet and file in. As we passed through the door, we were directed to the right and left and ordered to disrobe. As fast as a man got his clothes off, he was hustled into another line of nude humanity, and the parade around the mill was on. As each man entered the medical barracks a number was stamped on his bare arm, much like the branding of cattle we thought. And passing into the first room, where a line of doctors awaited to receive him, he was thoroughly examined. The inoculation was a hypodermic injection of typhoid antitoxin, administered 3 times, with 10-day intervals. Few of us will forget the effects of the needle, or the violent dislike we developed for it. The manner of giving the smallpox vaccine was not attended with any technique. The vaccine came prepared in a glass tube and, as the soldiers passed in line, the tubes were broken and each man was cut across the arm with the jagged glass, inflicting a ragged wound. If the soldier flinched or cried out, then he was slashed again for good measure. Each week after our first appearance we were returned to the infirmary until 3 shots had been given. I never had any of the diseases which we were supposed not to have, but if the diseases were worse than the preventatives, I am certain I escaped death in its most violent forms. The inspectors concluded the examination by taking our fingerprints. Apparently we were to be treated like criminals, and, provided no physical defects were found, we were finally accepted as fit subjects to withstand the privations of military service. Mustering in, which took place immediately after the medical examination, consisted of a general survey of the family tree and the opening of an individual service record. We were happy to oblige the army with biographical notes, but completely lost courage when some tired clerk irritably and unfeelingly asked us, "Whom do you want notified in case you're killed?" There were 12 cages along the wall, screened with chicken wire and with an opening and counter in the front. 1 man was inside each stall, and as we passed each cage, a bundle of articles was shoved at us, underclothes from one cage and so on, down the line. We were told that we would be allowed 30 minutes to get into uniform and form a company front on C Street. It was a mess, as nothing was issued according to size as needed. We were told to trade around for our sizes. The waist of the breeches I received was about 40 inches and I needed 22 inches. The shirt was twice as large as I needed, as were the underclothes. I went to the sergeant in charge, who laughed and said, "See your company tailor." I tried to find someone to trade with to get a couple of items I could use, but even these were too large. I could easily stick my hands inside the fastened canvas leggings. The shoes were of white elk skin and about size 8. I wore size 5.5. The felt hat was so big that I had to fold my ears out to keep it from covering my eyes. About that time, the whistle sounded, "Fall in." I dashed over to the cage again and demanded another uniform. My request was met with laughter, so I rushed out to get in line. They had already lined and were counting off when I appeared. Sergeant Smith saw me and barked, "You!" Front and center. The entire company was roaring with laughter. I told him that I tried to find a proper-sized uniform and that they had just laughed at me. He turned the company over to the other sergeant and took me back to the basement. If one ever heard hell raised, this was it. He sure told them off. An officer in charge came over and he was told about it, too. They tried hard to get me fixed up, but with little success. September 20th. Some more men came in during the night so that now the building is half full. This morning someone woke me up before daylight blowing on a horn. Everyone had to get up, dress, and get out of doors to answer roll call. After breakfast, we signed some more papers and the doctors gave us another exam. They must have found something wrong with all of us because they shot something into our arms. As for me, I felt better before getting the shot than I do now. Spent most of the day picking up cigarette butts around the barracks. Every time I stopped, a man in uniform named Lewis, who seems to have lots of authority, told me to get busy. September 21st, more men came in today, so that there are nearly 100 in this one building now. This morning, some of us scrubbed tables in the mess hall until they are nearly worn out, while the rest worked outside the building. After dinner, Lieutenant Foster took us for a long march all around the camp. After that we learned to salute all men in uniform who wear caps and look well dressed. Also to say, "Sir," to all of them. I won't be able to do much saluting unless my arm gets better soon. October 1st, Lieutenant Smith stopped me this afternoon, and asked what I thought the buttons on my coat were for. I asked him what the joke was. Guess there was no joke about it, or if there was he couldn't see it, because he got pretty mad and said, "You'll have to get wise to yourself. Keep those buttons buttoned and take some of that junk out of your pockets. You'll get a barack bag pretty soon that will hold most of it. Stand up straight. Put your hat on the front of your head. Get onto yourself and try to look like a soldier. That's all. When I got away from him I decided that if having one button unbuttoned caused all that trouble, I had better be more careful. We were at the gates of the camp. The front line was told to go around the building to the left, the back line to the right. It seemed like a good deal of formality, but we adhered to instructions. I was getting along in good shape, as I supposed, when someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're missing all the cigarette butts and cigar stubs. Get them all." I beheld a corporal whom I hadn't seen before. "What's the big idea, picking up such trash as that?" I queried. "The ground will be covered again before we get around the building. Do as you're told." There weren't any signs or symptoms of friendliness in the fellow's voice or eyes, so I backed up, and from then on made a better job of it. Before I had made the round, I had enough butts and stubs to supply my grandfather with clippings for a month. I was also beginning to feel a desire to spread someone's nose all over his face. Most of the officers were very nice to us, but some of the old non-coms gave us hell and told us how dumb we were. Again we began to hear the familiar cry we heard in the depot brigade, "Snap into it, and suck up your guts." Non-com, attention. Bring your heels together with a click. Suck up your guts and throw your chest out, that's not your chest. The rookie is trying all he knows how to throw his chest out, but it comes out in the wrong place. The non-com then explains the position of a soldier at attention, which is, heels on the same line and as near to each other as the conformation of the man permits. Feet turned out equally and forming an angle of about 45 degrees. Knees straight, without stiffness. Hips level and drawn back slightly, body erect and resting equally on hips, chest lifted and arched, shoulders square and falling equally. Arms and hands hanging naturally, thumb along the seam of the trousers. Head erect and squarely to the front, chin drawn in so that the axis of the head and neck is vertical, eyes straight to the front. Weight of body resting equally on the heels and balls of the feet. There were only a few uniforms ready, and the men had to drill and work in their civilian clothes and shoes. Some were dressed in overalls, and some in white shirts and collars. In the latter part of November, when the Secretary of War, the Honorable Newton D. Baker, came to camp to review the division, he still found many of the men wearing their summer underclothing, blue overalls, and civilian shoes, and no overcoat as they passed the reviewing stand. According to the medical department of the Army, the average new recruit was between 21 and 23 years of age and unmarried. He stood 5 feet 7 inches J per 2 inch tall and weighed 14 p per 2 pounds. 7 out of 10 of the rookies arriving at the training camps were draftees. About 31% were illiterate. Approximately 18% were foreign-born, according to later estimates. Statistics indicate that states from the central section of the country, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, provided the healthiest men. 70 to 80% of the draftees from those states survived both the Selective Service and U.S. Army physical exams and were accepted for service. Lowest in physical condition were draftees from the Northeast and the Far West, notably New York, the New England states and California, where 50 to 59% of the candidates were accepted. Country boys fared better on physical exams than men from the cities, whites fared better than blacks, and native-born Americans fared better than immigrants. The officers of the 15th Field Artillery were a very congenial lot. Most of the detail work was done by the second lieutenants, who had just come from civilian life. We were all very young, 23 or 24. And in such good physical health that we could stand nights of no sleep and long hikes. A couple of hours sleep at any time would put us back into first-rate shape. Most were recent graduates of Ivy League colleges. Obie Cunningham was Yale 14, Jim Husted the same, Jim Bruce was Princeton 16, Eddie LaMarche was Princeton 15, Jack Clark was Amherst 17, Rod McIntosh was Yale 14, Marsh, our telephone officer, was a recent graduate of the University of Minnesota, Mike Walsh was Brown 14. Roger Griswold was Harvard 14, Dick Peabody was Harvard 15, as was I. Our battalion commander, Major Benjamin M. Bailey, was a regular Army officer, as were the 3 battery captains. My own platoon was made up of a gang of the toughest and most hard-boiled doughboys I ever heard tell of. There were bartenders, saloon bouncers, ice men, coal miners, dirt farmers, actors, mill hands and city boys who had growed up in the back alleys and learned to scrap ever since they were knee-high to a duck. They were mixed up from most every country. They could out-swear, out-drink and out-cuss any crowd of men I have ever knowed. They sorter looked upon leave-breaking as a divine right. They were always spoiling to have it out with somebody. They were fighters, and that's all about it. If you looked at them sorter sideways for even a second, you were in danger of being on the wrong end of a punch. If you didn't drink, they kinder regarded you as being ignorant, and if you didn't cuss a blue streak every time you opened your mouth, you were considered to be most awful illiterate. A heap of them couldn't talk our own language at all, and any number of them couldn't sign their own names. The only way the captain could get them to larn to write was by telling them they couldn't get their pay unless they could put their signatures to the pay sheets. I recollect, too, we had a couple of farm boys from the South with us. When we were in New York, before sailing, they got their safety razors. They didn't understand them nohow. One of them fixed up his razor and tried to shave with it, but it weren't no good. He looked at it and said, "Anything the government gives you for noth, ain't never no good," and with a sort of disgusted look on his face he throwed it away. The other one tried several times without even cutting a hair. Then he throwed his away too, and said he never had no use for the Democrats. Now they were in power, they had to go and buy razors that wouldn't shave. They were trying to shave with the wax paper on the blades. My personal orderly was a French-Canadian who had been a cornet player in the orchestra at Keith's in Boston. My horse orderly was a cow puncher from somewhere near Cody, Wyoming. My cook, George the Greek, came from a short-order restaurant of which he was the proprietor, in Denver. My sergeant major had been a court stenographer in Rochester, New York. My chauffeur was a mechanic from the Packard factory in Detroit. Another orderly was a farm boy from Iowa. He was only 5 feet tall, had tried to volunteer, had been turned down on account of his short stature, and then had been drafted. He was the maddest man I ever saw whenever the draft was mentioned. I mailed a report to Washington of the religious census of the camp. 74 creeds were protested by the 31,079 officers and men. The Roman Catholics led the list with 10,786 and are followed by 5,624 Methodists, then in order, Baptists, Lutherans, and Presbyterians. The list shows 81 atheists and infidels, 832 Jews, 15 Quakers. One soldier stated that socialism was his religion. I had never heard of some of the creeds, Golden Rule, Cavantic, and Nazarene.